Gary Payton stepped into NBA history as the cold standard of greatness, a name that forced every opposing guard to adjust both their breathing and their thinking from the very moment the game began. Over more than 17 NBA seasons, he wasn't just an outstanding point guard, he was the highest defensive standard that ever existed at that position. 9 times named to the NBA All-Defensive First Team, an unmatched achievement for a ball-handling guard, along with the Defensive Player of the Year award in 1996. A title that to this day remains the only one ever won by a guard in NBA history, etched Gary Payton's name into a territory almost no one dared to approach. He was the soul of the Seattle Supersonics throughout the 1990s, a leader who needed no speeches, the one who turned defense into the identity of an entire team. 9-time All-Star, multiple All-NBA selections, Olympic gold medal, NBA championship in 2006, and finally induction into the Hall of Fame, all of it created the image of a career that on paper had almost no flaws. Payton didn't just beat opponents, he broke them mentally, making even the greatest offensive stars admit that facing him was a suffocating, exhausting, and haunting experience. That was greatness measured by fear, by caution, by the feeling that an invisible wall was always waiting right in front of you. But behind those titles and that harsh spotlight was a man who paid the price with his own peace of mind. Gary Payton didn't defend purely on instinct. He defended out of the fear of being left behind, out of the memory of a boy who grew up in an environment where weakness meant disappearance. Every closeout, every piece of trash talk wasn't just to make opponents hesitate. It was also his way of reminding himself that if he stopped, if he softened, he would lose everything. That toughness gradually became the wall separating him from the world off the court. Broken family ties, relationships hard to repair, and a lingering sense of isolation even when standing amid tens of thousands of fans. That was the quiet price of a career that allowed no room for vulnerability. Gary Payton wasn't loved the way other legends were loved, because he chose to become fear itself in order to survive. Yet it was precisely in that harshness that his will shone clearest, the will of a man who accepted playing the villain role, accepted being misunderstood, as long as he never surrendered. He didn't fight to be applauded. He fought so he would never have to return to the place where he once had to learn how to survive. And that is the deepest tragedy, but also the greatest dignity, of Gary Payton. If you want to keep exploring the untold dark corners behind the legend of Gary Payton, where the pain, the will, and the true cost of greatness slowly come to light, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Thank you for joining me, and please stick around, because the story behind the glove has only just begun. Gary Payton's childhood didn't open with pure dreams or carefree afternoons streaked with sunlight, but with a cold truth that Oakland taught every kid too soon. If you're not tough enough, you disappear. The Oakland he grew up in wasn't a place that nurtured fragility. It was a city where car horns, arguments, and threatening silences crowded every street corner, where kids learned to observe before they learned to trust, where every step had to carry vigilance. There, dreaming wasn't a privilege, it was a risk. Weakness wasn't met with sympathy, but with the eyes of someone looking for the next target. Gary Payton grew up in that context, where no one taught you to love yourself, where no one told you that you had value just because you existed. The only thing passed down, through silence or through impact, was how to survive. To avoid being swallowed whole, you had to look dangerous before anyone else could test you. To avoid being erased, you had to make yourself untouchable. On those streets, Gary learned a bitter lesson. Passive defense only made you a victim, so he learned to attack first, not with fists, but with attitude, with a stare, with readiness to collide. That wasn't the choice of a kid who liked violence. It was the reflex of a boy who understood that if he hesitated, the world wouldn't wait. The toughness gradually became the only armor he could wear. With each passing day, that armor grew thicker, heavier, and harder to take off. No one taught Gary how to express fear, because in Oakland fear only made you vulnerable. No one encouraged him to speak about his hurt, because hurt was something others could use to destroy you. So Gary Payton learned to swallow everything inside, turning tension into focus, anger into fuel, fear into controlled aggression. The coldness of Oakland wasn't just in the weather or the gray concrete walls. It was in the way people were forced to grow up too fast. Gary had no luxury of prolonged gentleness. He learned to stand tall when doubted, to never back down when challenged, to let his silence make others wary. Those lessons weren't written down or taught in class, but they sank deep into every reflex. And then when basketball appeared as an escape, Gary didn't bring to it the pure joy of the game. He brought the weight of a boy used to having to protect himself. On the court he wasn't seeking freedom, he was seeking control. Every closeout was a reminder that he wouldn't let anyone get past him easily, because getting beat on the court echoed the feeling of being overpowered off it, a feeling he had sworn never to return to. It was from Oakland, from those years that allowed no softness, that the glove began to take shape, not as a basketball strategy, but as a survival instinct. Gary Payton didn't become tough because he wanted admiration, he became tough because he had no other choice. And the deepest tragedy lies there. When you grow up in a world that only teaches you how to survive, you carry that lesson through your whole life, even when no one is chasing you anymore. Oakland helped Gary Payton survive, but it also planted in him a slow-burning wound, a belief that if he let go even for a moment, everything would collapse. That wound didn't bleed, wasn't loud, but it followed him onto every court, seeped into every relationship, and became the cold foundation for a legend built more from fear than from peace. Gary Payton's school years didn't carry the shape of an early talent bloom story, much less the journey of a kid cushioned with praise. In school, and later in his early college years, Gary Payton wasn't the name that made teachers or coaches pause for more than a beat. He didn't stand out physically, wasn't seen as a prodigy, wasn't talked about as the obvious future of any team. In a world where attention usually favored those who shone early, Gary existed in the middle ground, good enough not to be cut, but never quite good enough to be given absolute trust. There were no special cheers for him, no affirmations that this path was made for you, just prolonged silence. And in that silence, Gary learned to read his own position, always on the edge, always having to try just a little harder. Not being praised wasn't just an emotional shortage, it gradually became a psychological sentence. Every time he was overlooked, every time his name wasn't called, Gary Payton didn't see it as circumstance, he saw it as evidence. Evidence that he wasn't good enough yet. Evidence that if he stopped, if he lagged behind others, he'd become that invisible boy from Oakland again, the one who could be replaced at any moment. Failure, no matter how small, never passed lightly. A bad game, a practice where he wasn't noticed, a repeated mistake, all of it piled up into a low, constant voice in his head, reminding him that his current spot was temporary. And because of that, Gary didn't allow himself to lose in the ordinary sense. Losing wasn't just losing a game, it was confirmation that his deepest fear was real. At Oregon State, where many found the joy of simply playing ball, Gary Payton continued living in a state of constant tension. He didn't step onto the court ready to enjoy, he stepped on feeling like he was entering an endless evaluation. Every game was a test of his worth, every minute on the floor, a chance to prove he deserved to stay. But the paradox was this: even when he played well, Gary never truly felt relief. Winning didn't bring complete joy, it only temporarily silenced the fear. When the final buzzer sounded, the anxiety didn't vanish, it just retreated, waiting for the next chance to rise. He didn't play to feel happy, he played to avoid the feeling of being left behind, a feeling that had followed him since those early school days, when every glance passed over without stopping. It was in that environment that the obsessive mindset began to form. Gary Payton no longer clearly separated his human worth from his results on the court. A bad day wasn't just a bad day, it was a day he questioned his right to exist in this game. No one told him that failure was a normal part of growing up. Instead, life experience taught him that failure could shove you back into the darkness very quickly. So Gary chose the only path he believed was safe, never allowing himself to relax. He trained harder, defended more fiercely, reacted faster than necessary, as if someone was always ready to take his spot if he slowed even one step. The psychological tragedy of Gary Payton lies right there. Winning didn't bring innocent joy or a sense of fullness. Winning only made him less afraid, only bought him a little more time to stay. The more he won, the more subtle the fear became, because he understood that the standard would always rise, that tomorrow he'd have to prove himself all over again. In that inner world, there was no such thing as enough, only one question repeating endlessly: if I stop today, will anyone even remember me? And when that question had no answer, Gary Payton chose to live in a constant state of readiness to fight. The boy who wasn't allowed to lose gradually became the man who wouldn't allow himself to weaken, because in his mind, weakening meant being left behind, being erased, returning to the place he had spent his entire childhood trying to escape. Seattle came to Gary Payton like a belated promise, an unexpected door opening after years of always standing on the edge. When he was drafted by the Seattle Supersonics, Gary didn't step into the NBA with the glow of a hyped-up genius. He stepped in carrying the familiar fear of being replaced in every stride. But Seattle was different. That city, that team, for the first time saw him not just as a temporary option, but as an answer. In a time when the Sonics were searching for an identity, Gary Payton brought what they needed most: a cornerstone ready to absorb every collision so others could breathe. Seattle believed in Payton not with fancy words, but with responsibility. They gave him the keys to lead, to set the tempo, to establish the defensive standard for the entire team. And for someone who grew up haunted by the obsession of not being good enough, that trust carried an almost overwhelming weight. For the first time, Gary Payton felt something he'd never had before: the feeling of being needed. The early years in Seattle weren't a red carpet path, but they were a journey with direction. Payton wasn't the most explosive scoring star, not the name that lit up the scoreboard constantly, but he was the one who made everything hold steady. Every closeout, every read, every time he positioned himself between his teammates and the opponent, gradually built a collective belief that as long as Gary Payton was there, the Sonics hadn't fallen. The city that was used to rain and gray skies began to see a reflection of itself in his style of play: resilient, unflashy, outlasting the opponent. Over time, Payton wasn't just a player for Seattle. He became the soul of the team, the one who set the bar everyone else had to reach. And for the first time in his life, his toughness was no longer seen as a burden. It was understood, appreciated, viewed as the foundation. Recognition came slowly but steadily. All-Star, All-NBA, All-Defensive. Those honors weren't just statistics. They were signs that the world had finally seen what Seattle had believed all along. Gary Payton, the kid who was never favored in school, the one who had to convince himself he deserved to be there, now stood in the NBA as a standard. At home games, Sonics fans didn't cheer for flashy plays. They rose to their feet for defensive stands that disrupted the opponent's rhythm. Payton didn't need to smile much, didn't need to talk much. His presence alone created a sense of security. That was an emotion he'd never dared dream of in the years before. But even in what seemed like a safe harbor, the seeds of tragedy began to take root. Because for Gary Payton, everything beautiful came with a quiet dread, the fear that if he eased up, this miracle would vanish. Seattle's trust, instead of fully soothing him, unintentionally deepened the pressure. He didn't allow himself mistakes, because he understood that the role of soul was never permanent. Every good game wasn't a reward, it was an obligation to repeat. And when a team places its identity on your shoulders, you don't just play for the present, you play to protect a fragile belief. Seattle gave Gary Payton the dream he'd waited his whole life for: to be seen, to be recognized, to stand at the center without having to ask permission. But that very dream also began to take other things away from him: time, lightness, the ability to accept that he wasn't perfect. The more important Payton became, the more he locked himself deeper into a role that wasn't allowed to break. He learned to endure in silence, because if the leader showed a crack, the whole structure would shake. And in those rare moments when he looked around Key Arena, amid the cheers and overflowing belief, Gary Payton still felt an unnamed premonition. Everything was too perfectly in place, too complete compared to what he'd ever known. A part of him understood that life never gives anyone anything for too long. Seattle had given him everything: a role, a community, a collective dream. But precisely because of that, when Judgment Day arrived, when that dream was tested at its highest level, the fall wouldn't just be a team's failure. It would be the moment when everything that seemed most solid began to crumble, and Gary Payton would have to face the most painful question: would the recognition he'd finally earned be strong enough to save him from the fear that had followed him his entire life? The nickname The Glove didn't emerge as a branding campaign, nor was it a media gift for Gary Payton. It formed gradually, in sweat, in the never-relaxed tension, and in the deep-seated fear that if he let go for even a moment, everything he'd fought so hard to gain would dissolve. Defense for Gary Payton was never simply a skill, it was the language of survival, the only way he reminded himself that he was still here, that he hadn't been pushed back into the darkness where he'd grown up. And along with that defense, trash talk was born not as arrogance, but as a desperate roar. It wasn't the boast of someone secure in their position, it was the relentless effort to keep himself present in the minds of opponents, referees, fans, and history itself. Gary Payton talked so much on the court, not because he loved the sound of his own voice, but because he feared silence. Silence had once enveloped him through all those years of being overlooked, unpraised, unfavored. Silence had once meant you didn't matter. So every piece of trash talk was a way to banish that ghost, an assertion that he wouldn't let himself be passed over again. When Payton closed out on an opponent, stole the ball, and whispered words that broke their focus, it wasn't just strategy. It was the reflex of someone who believed that if he didn't make others remember him, the world would quickly forget. The ferocity in Payton's game gradually became his brand, but at the same time it turned into an invisible chain. Because once you're known as the embodiment of defense, of pressure, you're no longer allowed just okay days. Every game, Gary Payton stepped onto the court, carrying the weight of the very nickname he'd created. A lapse wasn't just a personal mistake, it was a betrayal of the glove image, and so he forced himself to stay tense constantly, never allowing himself to slip to average. There was no concept of rest in that mind, only holding the position or losing everything. Seattle loved Payton because he gave them a sense of safety, but that very feeling also kept him from ever stepping back. He had to keep proving that their trust wasn't misplaced. With each passing season, the standard didn't lower, it only rose. People no longer asked whether Gary Payton defended well, they asked whether he was still as sharp as before, and for someone accustomed to living in fear of being replaced, that question was never harmless. It revived the old feeling that his current spot was only temporary, that someone was always waiting for him to stumble. Trash talk, therefore, was no longer a choice, it became a psychological duty. If he went quiet, if he toned down the edge, if he allowed himself to soften, in his eyes that meant voluntarily removing his final layer of armor. Gary Payton didn't believe the world would patiently wait for him to find himself again. He believed the world only remembered the one who caused trouble, the one who made things difficult, and so he accepted the villain role. He accepted being hated, as long as he wasn't forgotten. The tragedy lay in this: the more successful he became in that role, the more trapped Gary Payton became. Defense was no longer something he did, it was something he had to do to survive. Every time he stepped onto the court, he wasn't just facing opponents, he was facing himself, facing the fear that if he wasn't ferocious enough today, tomorrow, he'd be seen as washed up. That tension built over the years, seeping into every muscle, every decision, every smallest reaction. Outsiders saw an untiring warrior, but few recognized the price of never being allowed to tire. Gary Payton didn't allow himself to enjoy his career in a light way. He didn't know how to play ball just to play. Every game carried the shape of a final stand, where he had to prove he deserved to stay, and in that state, defense, the quality that built the legend, gradually turned into the lock that imprisoned him in an inescapable image. If he stopped tensing, he believed the world would forget him instantly. That belief didn't come from arrogance. It came from the life experience of someone overlooked too many times to dare trust in long-term stability. Deep down, Gary Payton understood that no one could maintain that level of tension forever. But understanding didn't mean letting go, because letting go required a faith he'd never been given, the faith that he still had value even when not at peak fighting state. So he kept tensing, kept defending as if every possession was a silent plea. Let me stay, remember me. "Don't let me disappear," and in that plea the tragedy took clear shape, a legend built from iron will, but also a man chained by the very thing that lifted him to the top. 1996 didn't come to Gary Payton as just a season, it came as a trial where history had already written the verdict, even though the defendant had done everything in his power. After years of straining to the point of exhaustion to hold his position, after turning defense into his very identity, Gary Payton entered the NBA Finals with the Seattle Supersonics, carrying not only the hunger for a championship, but also a lifetime of fear of being left behind. For him, that series wasn't simply a matchup against Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls, it was a confrontation with the very fate that had chased him since Oakland, since the days when no one called his name. Seattle had gone farther than any dream they'd ever dared imagine, and Payton was at the center of that dream, the soul who'd kept the team standing through every round. But standing before the Bulls, before the perfect machine of history, he understood this wasn't a place for small errors. This was where history chose winners, and usually only one. The early games of the finals passed like a slow nightmare. Michael Jordan scored, the Bulls controlled the pace, and Seattle was swept into a vortex they couldn't adjust to in time. Gary Payton, who'd spent his life imposing his will on opponents, suddenly found himself passive, not because he played poorly, but because everything moved too fast, too soon. Before he was assigned to guard Jordan directly, before the strategy placed the full burden on the glove, the series had already tilted toward Chicago. Each loss didn't just widen the score gap, it deepened Payton's quiet dread. Was this the moment when all his lifelong efforts would finally be shoved aside by a script that didn't allow him to intervene? When Gary Payton was assigned to guard Michael Jordan directly, the atmosphere shifted. Not loud, not Hollywood dramatic, but there was a clear change in the breathing rhythm of the series. Jordan was no longer as comfortable as before, every catch had to face pressure, every move was anticipated a beat ahead. Payton did what he'd always done, made his opponent think, doubt, and tire. In the games that followed, Seattle won, not by miracle but by the stubbornness built over many years. And in those moments, Gary Payton proved he was second to no one in ability, in heart, in preparation. He locked down Jordan in a way few ever could, pulling the series back from the brink of collapse. But the tragedy was this: everything came too late. History doesn't wait for perfect adjustments. The Bulls had already built enough advantage, enough psychological momentum, enough distance that they no longer needed to be flawless. Seattle, even fighting with everything they had, stood before a door that was almost already closed. When the series ended, when the Bulls raised the championship trophy, there was no feeling that Gary Payton had failed because of lack of effort or lack of talent. The only feeling left was the cold reality: you can do everything right and still not be chosen. For Gary Payton, that wasn't just a sporting defeat, it was the moment when his entire life journey condensed into one unanswered question. He had defended to the point where no room remained for error, led the team with silent sacrifice, faced the greatest legend of the era without backing down. But when the lights went out, when the cheers turned to the other side, he still stood there, no ring, no champion title, and with the painfully familiar feeling that he had come so close, yet wasn't allowed to touch it. That opportunity, for Seattle, for Payton, was one of a kind. And when it closed, there was no guarantee it would ever open again. The core tragedy of 1996 wasn't in the numbers, it was in how history remembers. People remember the Bulls' 72 wins, remember Jordan's perfection, remember the trophy. Gary Payton, the one who made the series suffocating, the one who did what few dared admit, was placed on the edge of the story, not because he was wrong, but because the story needed a single central figure, and Payton wasn't chosen for that role. After the finals, Gary Payton carried a wound that's hard to name. It wasn't bitterness, nor resentment. It was the exhaustion of someone who understood he had poured out everything, yet the world turned away so quickly. In the years that followed, whenever he looked back on 1996, Payton didn't see specific plays. He saw a familiar emptiness, the feeling of having done enough, fought the right way, yet still having to accept that some historic moments aren't for everyone. And that's why 1996 became the most tragically peaked moment in Gary Payton's life. No clear mistake to fix, no enemy to blame, just a cold truth. History passed him by, leaving behind a defensive legend with empty hands. He didn't collapse, didn't break, but from that moment on, a part of him understood that the path he chose wouldn't be rewarded with easily remembered symbols. He would keep playing, keep tensing, keep proving his worth. But deep inside, 1996 had closed a door he knew might never reopen. And that is the deepest tragedy, not losing because of a mistake, but losing because history chose another name. After 1996, Gary Payton didn't collapse, but he entered a state even more cruel than defeat, the silence of history. No championship ring, no crowning moment to close the story, the way America loves to tell its legends. Payton was pushed into a gray area where all his efforts seemed insufficient to be forgiven. He didn't disappear from the NBA, didn't decline in performance, didn't lose his identity, but the gaze directed at him changed. Debates about the greatest guards, GOAT lists rewritten every year, gradually overlooked the name Gary Payton, as if he were an awkward exception. No one denied his talent, but no one quite knew where to place him without the ultimate symbol history demands. The ring at the right time. In American sports culture, the ring isn't just a title, it's the ticket to collective memory, and Payton didn't have that ticket, at least not when he needed it most. People began attaching a cold label to him, not big enough to be ranked alongside icons retold for decades, not big enough, even though he was the best defensive guard to ever play point guard, not big enough, even though he made Michael Jordan adjust, even though he carried an entire team farther than anyone imagined. That label wasn't said with malice, but the calm way it was accepted was the most painful part. Gary Payton didn't fight back. He didn't seek excuses, didn't stand up demanding recognition. He kept playing the only way he knew, tensing, defending, pressuring, proving night after night that he was still here. But with each passing season, the gap between what he gave and what he received seemed to grow wider. People began to see his presence as a given. They got used to Payton always handling the hardest part, always accepting the role that made others more comfortable. And when that became normal, it also became invisible. The tragedy of Gary Payton after 1996 wasn't that he played poorly, it was that he played his role too perfectly. Defense doesn't create easily remembered highlight reels. Sacrifice isn't measured in scoring numbers. And so what he did, though essential, was hard to turn into legend the way media loves. Payton traded likability for effectiveness, accepted being the one who made games uncomfortable so the team could survive. But when the story is retold, those details are often shortened, blurred, or completely omitted. No ring means no forgiveness. Every time Payton is mentioned, there's always a hanging but at the end. But he didn't win a championship. But he wasn't the primary scorer. But he didn't deliver iconic moments. Those buts stack up, forming an invisible wall, keeping him out of the biggest NBA history conversations. And for someone who grew up fearing being overlooked, that wall revives a numbingly familiar feeling. All of Gary Payton's sacrifices seemed unrewarded in the way society expects. He paid with his body, with relationships, with prolonged tension, yet in return only received half-hearted acknowledgement. Respected, but not cherished. Recognized as elite, but not placed on a pedestal. That's the most uncomfortable position for a legend, not failed enough to be completely forgotten, but not victorious enough to be immortalized. In the years that followed, every time a new season began, every time younger names were celebrated, Gary Payton was still there, still tensing as if he'd never been allowed to relax. But deep inside, he understood that a door had closed. 1996 didn't just take the ring from him, it took the only chance for his life story to be told in the easiest way. From then on, everything he did carried a tone of resistance, as if he were trying to prove that greatness shouldn't be measured by a single symbol. And in that very effort, the tragedy grew heavier. Because Gary Payton wasn't fighting to change how history works, he was fighting so history wouldn't erase him. But history has no compassion, it only remembers what's convenient to tell, what's neat, what fits easily into an image. No ring, no forgiveness, and Gary Payton, though still standing tall on the court, began to feel clearly that the path he chose would never lead to a gentle ending. He would continue to exist in the silence between glory and oblivion, carrying all the sacrifices the world would never fully repay. After years of being treated coldly by history, Gary Payton returned home to a truth even harder to face than any on-court failure. He didn't know how to live without the whistle, without opponents, without a clear role to tense against. On the court, everything had structure, rules, specific goals. You defend, you win, or you lose. But in family life, there's no scoreboard to show if you're doing it right or wrong. And for someone who'd spent his entire life surviving on iron discipline and absolute control, that world became blurry, even frightening. Gary Payton's marriage didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It cracked slowly, quietly, much like how his body wore down through each season. The years he tensed to become the glove took from his family a husband who knew how to listen, a father who knew how to be fully present. Payton brought the toughness from the court home, not because he didn't love his family, but because he didn't know how to remove that armor. In his mind, softening meant danger, loss of control, vulnerability. But family isn't an opponent to be locked down, and the cold silence that once helped him survive out there became the wall separating him from those closest to him. He was used to speaking through actions, through endurance, through material responsibility, but awkward in moments that needed words, that needed admitting he could be wrong too. When tension arose, his reflex wasn't to apologize, it was to tighten more, go quieter, as if holding his stance would make everything okay. But in family life, that silence didn't protect anyone, it only widened the distance. The marriage's end wasn't just the close of a relationship, it was the exposure of a painful truth. Gary Payton had known how to fight his whole life, but had never been taught how to heal. His family bore the consequences of a man always in a defensive ready state, someone unused to voicing fear, even less used to acknowledging others' pain. He wasn't heartless, but his hardness made those around him feel like they lived next to a fortress, safe but cold. When the marriage ended, there was no single moment of release, only a prolonged sense of emptiness, as if a part of his life had passed without him realizing what he'd lost. The broken family also brought another pain, deeper and quieter, the relationship with his children. Gary Payton always wanted his kids to be strong, wanted them not to be crushed by the world the way he had once witnessed. But in that effort, he sometimes forgot that strength doesn't only come from toughness. The distance formed not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of language to express it. He didn't know how to say he was afraid of disappointing them, didn't know how to admit that he was still learning how to be a father, and when those moments that needed gentleness passed by, they didn't come back easily. The greatest tragedy of Gary Payton's personal life wasn't that he failed, but that he didn't know how to apologize. Not because of arrogance, but because his entire life had programmed him to believe that apologizing was a sign of weakness. On the court, weakness meant getting beaten. But in family, not knowing how to apologize left cracks that were never patched in time. He carried that guilt in silence, without show, without complaint, but heavy like a weight hanging in his chest. As the arena lights dimmed, Gary Payton began to realize a bitter paradox. He had spent his whole life making sure no opponent got past him, yet he didn't know how to get past his own mistakes in personal life. No cheers, no bench, no playbook to adjust, just a man facing damaged relationships with no skills to repair them. And in that silence, Payton understood that there are battles you can win with will alone, but there are also battles where will by itself isn't enough. His personal life cracked not because of a lack of effort, but because he had learned too well how to tense up, to the point of forgetting how to let go and say the words a normal person needs to say to hold on to the people he loves. After his personal life fractured, Gary Payton didn't collapse the way people might imagine. He didn't break down, didn't complain, didn't seek sympathy. Instead, he slipped into another state, quiet and prolonged. Loneliness became a habit. Not the intense loneliness of a shock, but a steady, gradual loneliness that seeped into the rhythm of life, until you no longer noticed it. Gary Payton continued to appear in public with the familiar posture, straight back, hard eyes, firm voice. But behind that image, he had almost no true close friend, no shoulder to unload the exhaustion accumulated over the years. His whole life he had been used to being the one standing in front of others, the last line of defense, the gatekeeper who didn't let danger through. And when you live long enough in that role, you gradually forget that you yourself also need protection. In the locker room, Payton was the one teammates trusted. On the court, he was the one who made opponents hesitate. But when the final buzzer sounded, when the lights faded, he was often the one leaving in silence. Not because he wasn't sociable, but because he wasn't used to opening up. Gary Payton never learned the habit of confiding, because early on he understood that speaking out didn't make things safer. Whatever he carried inside, he kept it, suppressed it, turned it into focus, turned it into defensive energy. But that energy didn't disappear when the game ended. It stayed, tense, with no outlet. No close friends didn't mean no people around. Gary Payton always had acquaintances, colleagues, surface-level connections, but a close friend is someone who can see you when you don't have to tense up, and that was something he rarely allowed to happen. He feared that moment, feared someone seeing him tired, seeing him uncertain, seeing him unsure, because in his world, the gatekeeper isn't allowed to show weakness. Once you admit you need protection, you've admitted you can be hurt. And Gary Payton had spent his whole life avoiding that admission. That loneliness wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It followed him through every city, every season, every new home. There were evenings after fulfilling every responsibility, when Payton sat alone with the thought that if he vanished from this game tomorrow, would anyone really know what he was feeling? He didn't voice that question, because the answer, whatever it was, felt terrifying. Instead, he kept doing the one thing he was good at: standing guard, guarding for the team, guarding for teammates, guarding for the image the world had grown accustomed to. Gary Payton's entire life was that of a gatekeeper in both the literal and figurative sense. On the court, he stopped drives, disrupted rhythms, didn't let opponents cross the line. Off the court, he unconsciously kept distance, didn't let anyone get too close. That distance kept him safe, but it also isolated him. When you're used to controlling everything, depending on others feels uncomfortable, and when dependence feels uncomfortable, you choose loneliness as the lower risk option. The deepest tragedy lies here: the protector of others, but no one protecting him. When Gary Payton was tired, no arms were waiting. When he doubted his own worth, no familiar voice whispered that he was still enough. Moments of vulnerability, if they happened, occurred in absolute silence, and because they weren't shared, they didn't fade, they accumulated. Loneliness was no longer a temporary state, it became part of his character, a habit accepted as natural. Outsiders saw a powerful legend, but few saw that that strength was maintained at the cost of prolonged isolation. Gary Payton had protected so many people, stood in front so many times, that no one thought he might also need someone to stand behind him, and perhaps he himself didn't realize he needed it until he had grown too used to not having it. In the world of gatekeepers, there's no knock at the door for them, and Gary Payton, who spent his life making sure no one got past, ultimately stood alone at the very boundary he created, continuing to guard, continuing to endure, in a silence so long it became normal. Leaving Seattle wasn't a loud decision for Gary Payton, but it carried the weight of an irreversible goodbye. It wasn't just leaving a team, it was leaving the only place that had ever understood him without him having to explain. The Seattle Supersonics had seen Gary Payton from the days he had to tense up just to be noticed, until he became the soul of an entire collective. There, his defense wasn't seen as annoying, his trash talk wasn't seen as rude. Everything was in its right place, understood as an essential part of the identity. And then, when that door closed, Gary Payton stepped into the outside world with an emptiness hard to name, as if he had just lost the only language he spoke fluently. On new teams, Payton was still Gary Payton on paper, but he was no longer the center of the story. No longer was there an entire system built around his defensive pressure, no longer a city ready to accept his edge as part of the collective personality. He became a piece, a former star brought in to add experience, to help the team get better. It sounded respectful, But for someone who had once carried the whole team on his shoulders, that role carried a quiet pain. Gary Payton didn't know how to exist on the sidelines of the story. He had spent his life standing at the main gate, where every gaze had to pass through him. When pushed to the side, even just a little, he didn't know where to place himself. It was during those years that Gary Payton began to realize a truth he had avoided for a long time. He was getting old. Not the age measured by numbers on a birth certificate, but the age felt through how the world responded to you. Younger guards appeared with quicker speed, more flexible bodies, seemingly endless energy. They no longer feared the name the glove like before. They grew up watching him on tape, respected him, but didn't tremble when facing him. And in that moment, Gary Payton understood that the fear he once instilled was gradually losing its power. His identity began to waver. If he was no longer the fear, who was he? If he was no longer the soul of a team, what role did he have? Those questions didn't come up on the court. They appeared in the silences after games, when he sat alone listening to his body respond with familiar aches. Gary Payton had once accepted pain as part of the job, but now the pain was no longer offset by a sense of control. He hurt, but he was no longer the one dictating the pace. He was tired, but no longer the one the whole team relied on. Leaving Seattle also meant leaving behind the best memories of himself. There, he was the truest Gary Payton, tough, essential, irreplaceable. In other places he was a version constantly compared to the past. Every defensive play was no longer judged on its current value, but placed next to the image of the old Payton. And that comparison wasn't fair, but it was unavoidable. It reminded him that time wasn't on his side, that nothing was crueler than having to live in the shadow of himself. Gary Payton's identity crisis didn't explode into extreme actions. It happened slowly, layer by layer, like erosion. He kept trying to maintain the old standards, refusing to accept that there were nights he was no longer fast enough, strong enough, durable enough. And that very effort to fight the truth made him more exhausted. Because the harder he tried to prove he wasn't old yet, the more he realized the world had started seeing him as someone about to give way. In the years after leaving Seattle, Gary Payton stood between two worlds, the past where he was an icon, and the present where he had to learn to exist as something more ordinary. But learning to be ordinary was the hardest thing for him. His whole life had been defined by being different, by the role of gatekeeper that no one else could fill. When that role was gone, he felt like an empty room, where everything that once had meaning now just echoed. No longer being the center also meant no longer having control. Gary Payton had been used to controlling the game, controlling space, controlling the opponent's breathing. Now he had to learn to accept that some things were out of his reach, but acceptance was never his strength. He fought it by training harder, tensing longer, as if enough effort could turn back time. But time didn't listen. It kept flowing, indifferent, carrying away what he once believed was permanent. Leaving Seattle, Gary Payton didn't just leave a team. He left the version of himself he understood best. And looking back, he began to realize that his greatest fear wasn't losing games, wasn't being beaten by opponents, but the moment when he no longer knew who he was without standing in that familiar position. That was the deepest identity crisis, when you're still there, still playing, but no longer feel like you belong anywhere. When Gary Payton put on the Miami Heat jersey, it was no longer the story of a floor general or the soul of an entire collective. It was the story of a warrior nearing the end of the journey, carrying scars no uniform could hide. The 2005-2006 season opened with a prospect Payton had dreamed of for an entire decade, a real chance at a championship. But the bitter paradox was that, when that door finally opened, he didn't step through as the version of himself from years past. In Miami, he was no longer the glove who disrupted an opponent's breathing from the first touch. He was a veteran piece, a source of experience, a trusted name in moments that needed calm. On paper, it was recognition. In his heart, it was a reminder that time had taken the most important thing, the right to be the center. The ring in 2006 came like a logical conclusion to a career that had been too long and too heavy. The Miami Heat, with Shaquille O'Neal and Dwyane Wade, needed Payton in crucial minutes, needed his toughness, needed someone whose hands didn't shake. He filled the role, he defended when needed, read the game when needed, accepted stepping back so the younger players could shine. When the final buzzer sounded and the trophy was raised, Gary Payton stood in the moment he had chased his entire life. But the emotion didn't flood in the way people imagine. No prolonged eruption, no feeling that everything had finally been repaid. Because that ring didn't touch the place that hurt him most. There was a ring, but it wasn't the old Gary Payton's ring. The man who once lived off the fear of being forgotten now stood amid the celebration with a calm that's hard to name. He knew he had contributed. He also knew the Miami story would be told with other names. And that didn't make him angry. It only confirmed a truth he had learned after leaving Seattle: glory that arrives late has no power to heal old wounds. The years of being sidelined from big debates, the unrewarded sacrifices, the fractured relationships, none of it vanished just because of a round piece of metal. That ring carried acknowledgement, but not liberation. It didn't erase 1996, didn't soothe the feeling that history had chosen someone else at the decisive moment. It didn't give back the youth he spent tensing up, didn't patch the gaps that formed when he didn't know how to live off the court. On championship night, Gary Payton understood this more clearly than anyone. Some victories come at the right time, but not the right moment, and when the moment has passed, victory becomes only a period, not an answer. The most bitter part wasn't that the ring came late, but that it came in a different form. No longer an affirmation of "this is my team," but a confirmation of "I did my part." For many, that's enough. For Gary Payton, who lived his entire life as the gatekeeper, it left a vague emptiness. He no longer needed to shine, but he also didn't know what to do with that brief peace. Because peace for him had never been a familiar state. Glory doesn't erase old pain because that pain didn't come from a single failure, but from a life built on defense. You can win one season, but you can't win back the years spent in prolonged tension. Gary Payton realized that the ring didn't stop him from asking if things had gone differently. If 1996 had ended another way, would his life feel less heavy? That question doesn't need an answer, because its very existence says everything. After 2006, as the lights dimmed, Payton wore the ring as proof that he had once reached the top, but he didn't wear it to erase memories, he wore it to accept them. To accept that some victories don't come to heal, but to close. To accept that his career didn't need a fairy tale ending to have value, and to accept that glory, even when late, is still part of the journey, just not the medicine for wounds already etched deep. The ring came too late, but it came at the right time to teach Gary Payton one final lesson. Not every story needs to be rewritten to become prettier. Some stories need to be told exactly as they happened, with victories that don't heal, with pain that doesn't disappear, and with the dignity of a man who dared stand tall before that truth. After the late ring, Gary Payton didn't enter the final years of his career with a sense of release, but with a harsher reality. His body began to say the things he had deliberately ignored for decades. There was no horrific accident to make headlines, no dramatic break that forced an immediate end, just a slow, quiet erosion, like sand slipping through fingers. Back pain came first, not sharp agony, but a heavy feeling every time he stood up, every time he sat too long. Then came knees that no longer moved smoothly, strides that no longer sprang up on command. The body began to respond by slowing down, by refusing orders the mind was still used to giving. Gary Payton had lived his whole life believing that if the will was strong enough, the body would obey. He had beaten fatigue with discipline, beaten pain by treating it like background noise. But at some point, that noise no longer stayed behind. It stepped forward, present in every smallest movement. Every morning waking up, Payton no longer felt his body as a ready tool, but as a detailed record of every collision he had endured. The closeouts, the falls to the floor, the nights played with a body not yet recovered, all of it was logged, none of it erased. Gary Payton's physical tragedy didn't arrive in one moment, so it was hard for outsiders to notice. People still saw him walking normally, still saw him smile, still saw the image of a former healthy athlete, but inside every movement required calculation. Standing too long made his back stab, sitting too low made his knees protest. The pain no longer asked permission, It came as a reminder that the body has its own memory, and that memory isn't persuaded by titles or praise. No major accident also meant no moment for others to say he was so unlucky. Gary Payton had no pity attached to a fateful fall. Instead, he carried a kind of pain that's hard to explain. Pain from having done everything exactly the way the profession demanded. Erosion doesn't make headlines, but it creates long-term consequences. Every year of high-intensity play, every night of unrelenting defense, took away a piece of recovery ability. And when the career closed, the bills started arriving. In the days without competition, Gary Payton realized the body wouldn't let him forget the past. He could try to live slower, but the pain stayed, like an old friend refusing to leave. There were times rising from a chair when he had to pause a few seconds for balance, not from dizziness, but because his back needed time to agree. There were evenings when the dull ache lingered, and he remembered the games played with an unhealed body, the decisions made for the team, for pride, for the fear of being replaced. Then the body seemed to confess for him. Everything had been recorded. The body remembers every collision, not just physically. It remembers the mental state he lived through them with. Prolonged tension, constant bracing, years that allowed no softening, all left marks. Pain wasn't just in the back or joints. It spread into a deep, hard-to-name fatigue, a kind of tiredness not solved by simple rest, because it accumulated through a lifetime without knowing how to let go. Gary Payton once believed that when the career ended, the body would rest, and everything would be fine. But rest doesn't erase the body's memory, it only makes that memory clearer. Without the adrenaline of games, without cheers to drown the pain, Payton was forced to listen to what he had ignored, and what he heard wasn't pleasant. It was a belated confession that greatness had been built at a specific, measurable, irreplaceable cost. Gary Payton's physical tragedy didn't make him regret in the usual sense. He didn't wish he had played differently, because he knew playing differently would mean not becoming the man he became. But there were moments, when the pain lasted longer than usual, when he wondered if he had ever allowed himself to rest sooner, to soften more, to listen to his body more. That question wasn't to change the past, but to understand the present. The body breaking down slowly was a confession because it spoke the truth. Gary Payton rarely admitted aloud, "No one can tense forever without paying a price." Defense brought him fame, honor, and a place in history, but it also took away the lightness of later years. And in the silence of days without playing, Payton began to learn the hardest lesson: to accept that pain isn't an enemy to defeat, but a consequence to acknowledge. At this stage of life, Gary Payton no longer fought opponents on the court, but his own limits. Every careful movement, every daily choice was a form of adaptation. He didn't talk much about it, didn't seek sympathy. But his body, through signals impossible to ignore, spoke for him. Every collision was remembered. Every season left a mark. And greatness is never free. This isn't a tragic ending, but an honest confession that behind the defensive legend is a man learning to live with what he had to pay to stand tall for all those years. When Gary Payton watched his son step into the world of professional basketball, it wasn't just a moment of pure pride, it was the deepest inner challenge he had ever faced. Gary Payton II didn't carry the glow of a prince with a path already paved. On the contrary, his son entered the NBA with cautious steps, doubted, cut from rosters, seen as an incomplete copy of an overwhelmingly large shadow, and Gary Payton stood behind, silent to the point of pain, because for the first time in his life, he didn't dare step forward to shield him. Payton understood better than anyone the cost of expectations. He had lived his entire life in fear of being left behind, of being judged as not enough, and precisely because of that, when he saw his son struggling, he didn't want to become another layer of pressure. He didn't want his words, whether encouragement or guidance, to turn into an invisible burden. There were practices, there were nights his son came home after being cut from the lineup, when Gary Payton chose silence, not out of indifference, but out of fear. Fear that any advice would carry the shadow of a legend, fear that his intervention would make his son believe he only existed because of the name Payton. Standing back wasn't something Gary Payton was good at. His whole life he had been the gatekeeper, the one who stepped up first, the first line of defense, but with his son he had to learn a new role: to step back, to step back so his son could fall on his own, stand up on his own, find his own worth. And every time Gary Payton II was doubted, overlooked, a father's heart ached, because he saw the image of his younger self, the boy who wasn't favored, wasn't praised, who had to prove himself every day. The only difference was that this time he could intervene, and that very ability made him even more afraid. Gary Payton didn't want to recreate the wounds he had once carried. He didn't want his son to grow up feeling that love was tied to performance, that worth had to be proven through unrelenting defense or toughness to the point of isolation. So he chose the hardest way: trust. Trust that his son had the right to walk his own path, the right to fail, the right to not be like him. Trust that his silence, if timed right, would be a safer cushion than any guidance. But trust didn't make the worry disappear. It only made the worry quieter. When Gary Payton II found his footing, step by step, not because of the name, but because of defensive effort, energy and persistence, Gary Payton felt a very different kind of healing, not healing from victory, but from seeing his son chosen on his own terms. But that joy always came with lingering ache. Every time his son got hurt, every time he was doubted, he wondered if his silence was abandonment, if standing back was the right way to love, or just fear in disguise. In the rare moments when father and son sat together, Gary Payton didn't talk about strategy, didn't talk about how to lock down opponents. He talked about staying true to yourself, about not letting outside noise decide your inner worth. Those were the words he wished he had heard growing up, but he said them gently, without imposing, because he knew words could also become pressure. Watching his son move forward, he realized that healing isn't about rewriting the past, it's about not repeating it. The fear of hurting his son the way he had been hurt, that fear followed Gary Payton every day. It made him careful, made him slow down, made him learn to trust in someone else's growth, and in that process, he also learned to heal himself, not with grand declarations, but with presence at the right time and necessary silence. Watching his son move forward, Gary Payton understood that some battles didn't need him to charge in, some doors should only be opened from the inside, and for the first time, the man who had spent his life standing in front of the world, learned to stand behind, not because he had weakened, but because he loved enough not to turn love into chains. At 57, Gary Payton entered a phase he had never been prepared for in his entire life, the phase where he was no longer allowed to fight, not because of a lack of will, not because of a lack of desire, but because his body had withdrawn permission. Movements that were once instinct now required calculation. Mornings no longer began with goals, but with listening to see if his back would agree to let him stand straight today. The body, which had obeyed his commands through thousands of games, now became the final boundary, a boundary that couldn't be crossed with iron will. Fame was behind him. The highlight reels still played, the numbers still sat there, unchanged. But fame didn't warm him at night, didn't hold him up when pain stabbed suddenly, didn't answer the quiet questions age asked. Gary Payton no longer stood at the main gate of history. He stood on the sidelines, where the noise softened, where younger faces took the center. And in that shift, he learned a hard lesson. When your worth is no longer measured by collisions, you have to find a different measure. No longer allowed to fight sounded like a sentence to a man who had lived by defense. Fighting had been language, survival, identity. When that language was taken away, Gary Payton had to learn silence. Not the silence of giving up, but the silence of acceptance. Acceptance that some days, he could only walk slowly. Acceptance that pain was no longer a signal to push through, but a reminder to stop. And acceptance that stopping didn't make him less. It just made him different. Memories came more often now. Not glamorous ones, but small moments. The locker room smell of sweat, teammates' eyes when they needed someone to stand in front, the squeak of shoes on wood in crucial moments. Memories also carried quiet what-ifs. What if 1996 had gone differently? What if he had listened to his body sooner? What if he had learned to apologize more easily? But those what-ifs didn't seek answers. They just existed like shadows, reminding him that the path he took was one without safe detours. Aches became the background rhythm of life, not intense, but persistent. a kind of pain that forced negotiation with himself every day. Gary Payton didn't complain. He was used to enduring in silence, but enduring now was different from enduring while playing. When fighting, pain had purpose. Now pain was simply consequence, and that consequence forced him to look back at his career, not through glory, but through the specific price his body was paying. At 57, that man began to understand that strength no longer lay in standing in front, but in standing firm before the truth that fame passes through a life, while the body stays behind, the truth that not every legend has a brilliant ending, and not every quiet ending is failure. Some endings are simply a shift to a different rhythm, slower, with fewer cheers, but more honest. Gary Payton was no longer allowed to fight, but he was still allowed to remember how he had lived, what he had protected, what he had traded, and in that remembering, there was a rare softening, not because the pain disappeared, but because he no longer ran from it. He allowed himself to weaken a little, to slow a little, as a way of respecting the years that had passed. A quiet ending isn't absolute decline, it's a conscious withdrawal from the noise. Gary Payton didn't try to recreate the glow, didn't try to prove anything more. He left fame behind him where it belonged, and stepped forward, slow but steady, into a life where memories and aches coexisted, a life that no longer allowed fighting, but allowed acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, there was a very different dignity, the dignity of a man who knew when to stop, who knew how to listen to his body, and who knew that sometimes the greatest victory is no longer having to tense up to survive. Gary Payton didn't leave the NBA with a grand ceremony, nor was he sent off with history's full consensus. The game didn't stop to look back at him. The NBA always moves forward, cold and unwaiting, just as it had passed through so many other bodies before him. New generations arrived with faster speed, new stories told in the language of scoring, highlights, social media, and easily remembered symbols. In that flow, Gary Payton stood quietly on the sidelines, not because he was forgotten instantly, but because the game has no mechanism to hold on to those who paid the price the way he did. Payton understood that. He didn't blame the NBA, didn't blame the era, didn't blame the young stars taking the lights, because he had lived long enough in this game to know that basketball has no obligation to be fair to anyone. It only stays loyal to forward motion. What no longer fits that pace gets left behind, not for lack of value, but for not being in the right time. Gary Payton wasn't bitter about that truth. Bitterness requires believing you deserve different treatment, and he had learned early that his career wasn't built on demands, it was built on endurance. He paid with his body, not with one fateful fall that would make the world stop and pity, but with thousands of small repeated collisions accumulating over the years. He paid with nameless mornings of back pain, knees stiff like cold metal, steps that had to be measured even with no opponent in front. That body was the final bill of a defensive career, where every closeout took a little bit of the future, and when that future arrived, there was no one to collect the debt. The NBA moved on. New guards no longer trash-talked the way Payton did. Defense was no longer the center of the story. Rules changed, pace changed. Audiences changed. Kids growing up with basketball felt that everything had to be fast, beautiful, instantly memorable. In that world, Gary Payton's legacy isn't easy to retell in a 30-second clip. It lies in what can't be seen, the opponent's fatigue, the choked breathing, the discouragement creeping in after every failed attempt to get past, and what isn't easy to see is rarely easy to keep. But Gary Payton didn't blame anyone for that. He didn't try to rewrite his life story to make it easier to hear. He didn't need to be loved the way scorers are loved. He accepted his place as someone who did the hardest, least thanked but indispensable work. Some people are born to be remembered for brilliant moments. Some people exist to make sure others have those moments. Gary Payton belonged to the second group, and he knew it from very early on. Looking back, he didn't see a chain of injustice. He saw a consistent path. From the harsh Oakland to the trusting Seattle, from the 1996, where he wasn't chosen, to the ring that came too late, from a body worn down to age 57, where he was no longer allowed to fight. Everything connected into a cold but clear logic. He wasn't robbed of anything. He gave away so much, and the world simply took it and moved on. The greatest tragic aftertaste lies there, not in one specific tragic moment, but in the normalization of loss. Gary Payton didn't have a single day to mourn everything he had paid. He lived with it, day after day. And because of that, his story doesn't end in resentment, but in accepting silence. For American audiences, this is where the story stops, not as an easy-to-swallow moral lesson, but as a mirror that's hard to look into for long. Because American sports usually celebrates winners in the clearest way. But Gary Payton reminds us that there are forms of greatness that aren't in the stat sheet. There are people not remembered for how much they scored, but for how long they endured. Some men are remembered for how they scored. Others are remembered for what they endured. Gary Payton belonged to the second group. He didn't leave the game numbers that would make people marvel forever. He left a standard that's hard to copy, the standard of standing in front, of tensing up when no one else wanted to do it, of accepting the price without demanding equivalent reward. And as the NBA keeps moving forward, as new names get etched into collective memory, Gary Payton's story remains there, quiet, undemanding, like a reminder that this game wasn't built only by clutch shots, but by bodies that quietly wore down to keep it running. When looking back at Gary Payton's entire journey, the lingering emotion isn't simple regret, but a slow burning pain for a man who lived his whole life in a braced posture. From Oakland, where childhood taught him that weakness meant being swallowed whole, to Seattle, where he was trusted for the first time but had to pay by becoming the glove, who was never allowed to rest, Payton never had a truly safe phase. The 1996 NBA Finals was the most painful proof. He locked down Michael Jordan, did everything perfectly, but history still didn't choose him. No mistake to fix, only a door closed forever. The ring in 2006 with Miami came too late, when his identity had already wavered, and his body began to break from erosion, making the glory no longer strong enough to heal old wounds. Even more heartbreaking was life off the court. The toughness that helped him survive in the NBA broke his marriage, left him unable to apologize, unable to let go. He protected teammates, protected the team, but when loneliness stretched on, no one protected him. At 57, when his body no longer allowed fighting, Payton was left with memories and aches as the final bill for greatness. Yet it's precisely in that tragedy that Gary Payton deserves to be honored. He didn't resent the NBA, didn't blame history, didn't blame the era. He accepted that the game always moves forward, and legends can be left behind. The lesson for Americans lies here. Success isn't measured only by what you achieve, but by what you endure to achieve it. In real life, not everyone is remembered for brilliant moments. Some people deserve respect because they stood in front for others, paying with their own bodies and peace of mind. And sometimes, the greatest value isn't in victory, but in the dignity of not giving up, even when history didn't favor you. If the story of Gary Payton made you pause and think about the quiet price of greatness, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on the journeys behind the lights of legends. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video where more untold stories will continue to unfold.